Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm sharing my thoughts on the new Tim Holtz Distress Spritz and how I've used them to create this card. I'm also sharing some details on how I created my Distress Spritz Swatches, and I'll be sharing that here next. If you're interested in any of the products used in this video, you can find the supply list with links in the description box below. Just click on the word more to open it up and see all the links. When you shop through those links, you are supporting me, and I really appreciate that more than you know. So if you haven't heard, the palette of Tim Holtz Distress has expanded and a new product has been released called Distress Spritz. And while I'm not going to go into like all the nitty-gritty details of the product because Tim's going to be covering all of that in his live launch of the product, but I am going to share what I love about the product and how I'm using it throughout my project. So as you can see, it comes in a rainbow of colors, and by mixing and matching these, you can expand your color palette infinitely, especially when you start layering this product with other mediums, including Distress ink, Distress oxide, Distress paint, texture pastes, and yeah, it's really one of those products for me that is the experimentation of it has been a really fun process just to kind of see what does it do when I mix it with this and what does it do when I mix it with that, and the layering that it adds, and of course the shimmer. That cannot go without saying because this creates a beautiful finishing shimmer to your projects that coordinates with the colors. And what I mean by that, in true Distress fashion, picked raspberry is picked raspberry, barn door is barn door, and on and on. So this spritz coordinates with the same color in the ink, the oxide, the paint, and watercolor pencils, so that coordinates with all of the other Distress palettes. And as always, that's one of my favorite things about Distress, is that everything coordinates and matches. And because I know that palette really well, that just makes it much easier for me to work with. And so yeah, that right there is definitely my favorite thing about these. I also love the way they spray, and then just the finishing effect that they add to the project. So let's get into the making. The first thing I did when I got the Distress Spritz was to create swatches. It's usually one of my first kind of go-to things to do to kind of play with and learn a little bit more about how the medium works, especially when it's something new. And I just made a swatch for each one of the colors. So we got picked raspberry, barn door, worn lipstick, spiced marmalade, fossilized amber, twisted citron, peeled paint, peacock feathers, uncharted mariner, wilted violet, walnut stain, and then weathered wood. And if you're interested in learning more about how I create my swatches, I'll have a link to another video where I demonstrate the swatch process that I use. And what I did on this one is very similar. And I'll talk you through that, but I'm not going to show you in the video just for time's sake. but you can check out and reference that video for kind of the step-by-step on how to do my swatches. Some of the products that I use, and I'll have these linked down below as well, are these nested tag dies from scrapbook.com. I use this like third size one here that's like 3 by 4 inches or something like that for the tags. And then I use the mini detailed butterfly die set from Tim Holtz. And I like this because it has a solid butterfly shape that just gives you more like surface area to apply the medium to. So any kind of solid shape die would work. I mean, for that matter, you could use a circle or a square or whatever. The stencil I used on this particular swatch is this digit stencil, just some numbers there. And then the stamp set that I used here was the floral outlines, which I use this on all of my swatches for all the different distress colors. And then I also used the inspector, and I used this little strictly handmade stamp here in particular. But you could certainly switch these out for anything else. I would just recommend some sort of more like maybe detailed or delicate type image for the background stamping, just so that it doesn't overtake the main purpose of these to show the swatch of the color and everything. To create the swatches, I die cut the tag from Distress watercolor cardstock because I'm working with a liquid medium. The watercolor cardstock is a perfect paper to use. So after I'd done all the die cutting, then I stamped the tags with the floral outline using frayed burlap archival ink. I just wanted some sort of a permanent ink that wouldn't bleed or anything after like adding the other mediums. So that's why I used a permanent ink. After I stamped all the tags with that image, then I went and grabbed the coordinating distress ink to the Distress Spritz, and I did some ink smushing with the distress ink. So I applied the ink to the craft mat and smushed the tag into that and then dried it. Once that was dry, I placed the digit stencil over the tag, and I used a blending brush to apply the distress ink through the stencil just to add a little bit more interest there. So after I'd done the stencil work, then I added the Distress Spritz, and I just worked in a splat box and spritzed that onto the tag and let that dry. And then I stamped the strictly handmade with the distress ink in the same coordinating color, just to kind of show that you could stamp over the spritz and it would still show up. And then the last thing I did to finish these off was just to print out the names of each of the colors and just some white printer paper, trimmed them down, and then adhered them to the tags. So, and I just kind of repeated that process then for each of the tags until I had all of the colors swatched. So I hope you enjoyed this little overview of how I created my swatches using the new Distress Spritz. Now let's get into making the card. The mediums I'm going to be using on this card include, of course, the new Distress Spritz, and I'm working with Walnut Stain, Fossilized Amber, Uncharted Mariner, and Peeled Paint. I'm going to be working with Distress Oxide inks in Uncharted Mariner and Forest Moss. I've got Distress ink in Scorched Timber and Distress Spray Stain in Scorched Timber. I've also got VersaFine Clair, which is just a black pigment ink, so any kind of black pigment ink will work. And then I'm also going to be working with Black Soot Archival ink. For this, just any kind of permanent waterproof ink will work. And then I'm going to be working with Distress Texture Paste, Opaque. And this is just the old jar I'm trying to use up. And then Clear Embossing Powder. The other things I'm going to be working with is the Metropolis stencil. This is from Mini Set 51. The Vault Wildflowers die set. And then these two stamp sets, the Professor and Curiosity Shop. And I'm also going to be using the coordinating die set that is available through Simon Says Stamp that goes with the Curiosity Shop stamp set. If you don't have the die set, you can certainly fussy cut these. It's not the end of the world. Because and then the other thing to keep in mind too, this die does leave like a little white edge around the images. So you may or may not like that look, or maybe you love fussy cutting, but if not, this is out there, but only available at Simon Says Stamp. The paper I'm going to be working on for this is Distress watercolor paper, my always go-to for all things, because this one in particular, I'm going to be using a variety of inks, the spritz and texture paste, so I know that it's going to hold up and take all of those mediums and with no problems. As far as some of the tools you'll need is you'll need a palette knife, a water bottle or a distress sprayer, some blending tools, stamping block or stamping platform, a heat embossing gun and a heat tool, and then of course a die cutting machine if you're going to do any of the die cutting. So to get started, I'm working in a stamping platform. This is a Misty stamping tool, and I just have my watercolor cardstock, and I've cut it down to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. I just like to matte my card background, so I've kind of started just always trimming it down to the size I need, and then I don't have to worry about that later on. So for this stamping, I'm going to just kind of tuck this into the corner here. And like I said, we're going to be working with some images from the Professor stamp set, and just going to position that off to the side there. And for the stamping, I'm going to be using archival ink. You just need some sort of permanent ink. Something that's waterproof and is not going to run. But again, you can switch it out. You'll just get a very different look because you will lose the detail of the stamped image if you go with something that's a water reactive ink for this. Okay, so there's that one. Now let's scoot that over. I'm going to do a little more stamping off to the side here. And just kind of doing some layer stamping here. So there, I'll run that one along there. Then I'm going to come back over the top with that, but and there. There we go. Okay. So now we're going to continue on with the background, and at this point I'm going to do some ink smushing with the Forest Moss Distress Oxide ink, and I've got a distress sprayer here to add some water. And just smush the ink pad onto your craft mat there, and then you're just going to give it a good spritz with some water so it kind of beads up like that. And then I don't like to mix it around. I know Tim does. I just personal preference. I like to leave it like this and then just dip in and get that ink across the paper. And I try not to kind of dip back into where I've already got ink because it's just going to make it bigger puddles. So the trick with this is really just doing it in layers. And then I'm just drying this with my heat tool to kind of speed up the process of the ink drying. Okay, and then now we still have some of that ink on the craft mat, so I'm going to go back in and get some more of that, kind of try to fill in some of those areas that were open. Just kind of use up the rest of the ink that's on my craft mat there. As you can see, those little dots, if it's dry, the ink will layer on top of each other and kind of create this more layered effect and look. And we're just going to dry that. And you can continue like repeating this process as many times as you like. You just kind of go till you kind of like the look that you've created. You can always add more if you start off with less, so that's kind of always something you kind of keep in mind when you're doing this. All right, so clean that up. And there's a little spot there that just wasn't totally dry, so I'm just gonna dab that off. And now, so there is just the ink smushed background with the forest moss. All right, so now we're going to add some stenciling on top of this. And for that, I'm just using just regular Distress paste. And put that, get a little goop of it up here on my palette knife. And I'm just working on the back side of my palette knife. So let's position the stencil here. I've got it kind of hanging over the edge of the paper so that I don't get like any harsh lines up here in the corner. And if you need to have something to hold this down, you could use like a sticky mat or anything like that, but I'm just gonna kind of use my fingies to get it done. And I'm just gonna put a little bit of this paste kind of along this upper corner here. And you just wanna make sure you kind of just get a nice little even coat on. Lift that up, and I'm gonna do the same thing down over on this corner. Same thing, kind of having the stencil hanging over. Over out there, and then spread it along this edge here. There we go. And you just want to make sure that it's not on so thick that you can't see the stencil when you coat it through, like when you rub it over. So like if it's so globbed on that you can't see your stencil, you've got way too much paste. So just something to keep in mind there. And then you want to make sure once you're finished with the stencil and the paste that you get this either in a tray of water to soak while you continue on with your process, or just stop and go wash that stencil off, because trying to get the dried paste off of the stencil is not fun. So, and then obviously you're gonna clean off your palette knife, and then if you're working on a craft mat, you can, just let it sit here and dry. This paste dries pretty quickly, even here in a little bit more humid environment. And if you've got any of the paste hanging over, you can kind of use the back of your palette knife and just kind of wipe that off, or you can use your finger. Or when it's all done, you can even trim it off with some scissors once it's dry. So we're just gonna let that sit and dry, and I'm gonna go clean off my stencil and tools, and I'll continue on after that. So while the paste is drying, I'm gonna go ahead and do some of the other stamping, and this is using the Curiosity Shop stamp set, and these are the pieces that I'm gonna be using as like the embellishments for the card. So I've just got another piece of Distress watercolor paper in here, and I'm gonna be stamping a little typewriter and the little piece of paper there, and then the numbers. And as you can see, I cut my numbers in half when I first got this set for a card that I made during the launch, but it's easy enough to put them all back into one length there, so it's all good. All right, we're going to be doing a little bit of a mix of stamping here, so I'm gonna So I'm going to stamp the typewriter with the VersaFine Clair pigment ink, but any kind of a black pigment ink will work for this. And you can also stamp that as well with it. And I'm going to stamp the numbers with Distress Oxide in Uncharted Mariner. Give that one more coverage there. I need to re-ink this pad. It looks like it's getting a little bit dry. And I'm going to do one more time over this typewriter. Just want to make sure that ink is nice and still wet. And then I'm going to kind of set that to the side. And I'm going to pour some clear embossing powder over this. Now I'm working kind of quickly. If you don't want to do all this at once, you could just do one of these at a time. Just kind of wanted to do it all at once. Whoops. Alrighty. There we go. And now let's get this out of the way. And this is just a piece of printer paper folded in half. Just kind of helps me kind of keep the powder corralled a little bit. I still spilled some, so if you do, I like to use a little Swiffer duster to just kind of swipe that away. And now I'm going to take my heat embossing tool and heat set this powder. And I'm just going to stamp the little sentiment here. I'm just again using that, just going to use that same VersaFine Clair since I've got it out here. Here we are. Okay. So now the stamping is done, and then you can either fussy cut this or you can use the dies to cut these out, whichever your preference is. So now our texture paste is dry. So now we're going to move on to the next step for this background, and I'm going to be working in a splat box just to help contain the spray, but you could also work in a cardboard box, or you could just work straight on your craft mat. It's really up to you. And the Distress Spritz is what we're going to be working with here. And for this, when you work with these, you just want to make sure that you get all of the color kind of mixed in. As you flip these over, you can kind of see how it's just sitting there, depending on how you have them stored. So if you store them upright, they're really going to sit down on the bottom. If you have them on their sides, it's going to kind of be on whatever side was down. And there's a little rattling shaker ball in there that you just need to make sure you mix all of it up very well and get that pearl mixed in throughout the liquid. You just want to do that with all of them. Now the first one I'm going to use is the walnut stain, and as you're going to see when I spray this, the way the color goes down is really light. It's not meant to be like a solid coverage of color. It's meant to be kind of like a finisher. So this is just going to add like a layer of shimmer and shine to this, especially once the ink dries. So I'm just going to give it some spritz here, and it's, like I said, it's very different than the other sprays when you spray with them, how it can kind of cover up the paper sometimes. This really just adds like this light spritzed speckly effect that, and then you also get these like little bit bigger drippy drops. So it's definitely adds a touch of shimmer with the Distress style, and that I think is what I love more than anything. So from there you can just give that a little dry with your heat tool, and as you can see, the texture paste just kind of soaks up that ink from the spray or from the spritz, and it just absorbs into the texture paste. And that's just the nature of the texture paste. I don't know if you noticed before I even sprayed this on that the texture paste had kind of absorbed the oxide ink that was on the paper and had kind of colored the paste by pulling that pigment kind of up out of the paper a little bit. So like here where there's no color, it's just white, and then you've got that little bit of the speckles on there from the Distress Spritz, and it just adds this tiniest little bit of shimmer. And I've personally noticed, like, it seems like some colors are more of a vibrant shimmer than others. The walnut stain seems to be a little bit less, and it might just be you know, the color that I'm putting it over here where you don't see it as much. But I can tell you in person, if you can't see it here in the camera, but in person, it's absolutely gorgeous and beautiful, and I love everything about it. So now we're going to, I'm going to do that same thing again here with a little bit of the peeled paint, and just to add a little more color. And again, it's always just a subtle bit, but I love the shimmer and shine it's adding to things while still keeping things distressed and slightly grungy. And that just added another little bit of layer of shimmer on there that you probably can maybe hopefully see a little bit more even now. So the next thing I'm going to do is something I just always love to do with sprays, is to add some splatters. I'll just make sure we get these all shook up really well. And I'm going to add some splatters using fossilized amber and uncharted mariner and peeled paint. And to do that, just make sure you get it shaken up really well. Make sure all that pearl is mixed in. And then you're going to unscrew the lid, and you're going to just flick onto the paper there. And of course, you can do as much or as little as you want. If you shake more up and down, you're going to get a little bit bigger splatters. So it's really kind of up to you. And then before you move on to the next color, give that a dry. And that's also when you dry this, especially when it's a little more concentrated like it is in these splatters, you're really going to see it go from like not looking like much to getting nice and pretty and shiny once it's dry. But I really like how it doesn't interact with what you spray below it. Like what was there stays there. So I don't know, it's kind of cool. One of the effects of this stuff. Now I'm going to add some splatters with the Uncharted Mariner. And then we'll give that a dry. And the other great thing is once this is completely dry, that is not going to wipe off on your fingers. So I just rubbed over that. Nothing's coming off other than what's already on my hands from like the inks and stuff. But yeah, there's no shimmery stuff coming off on my finger at all. Now we're going to do one more bit of spritzing. And I think I said peeled paint. Yeah. So add some splatters with some peeled paint. I'll dry that. And then I think I want a little bit more down here. So I'm going to add a few more here. Up there. I just realized I'm going to be covering up some of that center part, so you're not going to see splatters that are only in the center of the paper. But again, as you can see, as you're drying, how that all those different colors are showing up there, especially real concentrated here, like with these little splatters. But they lend themselves to so many different ways to use them. I really can't wait to see how other people use them and all the different ways we'll come up with to play with them. So it's gonna be kind of fun, I think. So there is a look at the finished background. And then of course, like if you really wanted to get crazy, you could add some splatters with the walnut stain. And since I thought of the idea, now I have to do it. So let's do that as well. Just gonna get a little more grungy with this one here. I'll dry that. So here's a look at that background so far. And as you can see, you can still see what we originally stamped on the background through all these different layers of inks and sprays. And yeah, I just absolutely love that about these. So the final touch I'm going to do here for the background is just to ink the edges with a little bit of Scorched Timber Distress ink. And just using a little blending brush and kind of working it around the edges here. Just kind of working in a little bit of a circular motion, pulling that ink, like kind of starting off the craft mat and pulling it on and going around the edges here. And like with this, like if you didn't want, you know, any white showing, you certainly could have added more of the ink to begin with when we first were doing the ink smooshing technique. This is just still white because there was no ink there to begin with. There's just a little bit, all that's really over those areas is either the paste or that walnut stain spritz. And as far as the other embellishments, I took a piece of Distress watercolor paper and just sprayed it with some Scorched Timber Distress spray stain and a little bit of water, and then just dried that with my heat tool. And now I'm going to spray over that with the walnut stain, Distress Spritz. Make sure again they just give it a good shake and just give it a little coat of that. And really a little goes a long way. And then we're gonna try this. And as you can see, it's not covering up the scorched timber. It's just added this light coating of shimmer over the surface. So you still get all those cool details that were there before I sprayed it, so you can still see where I did the Distress spray stain, and now you've got another layer with the splatter of that pearl in there, and it's just, again, I think it's just gorgeous, and it's very subtle. Like I said, I feel like the walnut stain is a very subtle shimmer to it, but it's probably one of my favorite ones for that reason. And then what I'm going to do is take this and die cut some of these Vault wildflower dies from this paper and use them on the card. All right, so I've die cut my little flowers, and now I'm going to take the other die cuts that we made earlier, and I'm just going to ink the edges a little bit with some Scorched Timber Distress ink, and just using one of the little mini blending tools. I'm not sure this is called mini or the small. The names were like, now that he's got this new size, it's kind of confusing. But a big one would work too. Just the little one's a little easier to get in on some of these smaller pieces, especially like in there. And you know, if you do want to fussy cut these numbers, you could also just fussy cut the numbers that you want. You know, you don't have to keep them all in a line like this if you're cutting it by hand. But the thing that's nice with the die, you could easily cut, you know, that 1 and the 2 out and the 3 out and kind of separate everything if you wanted to do it after you've die cut them. Because in fact, I'm only going to use up to the 5 here myself. So I'm just going to trim. You can see, you can just easily trim that off. And then you've got this piece, you can trim that off. And then, you know, save that for another card. All right. And so, and then the other thing that's kind of cool with this die is it actually has a little slit in it so that you can slide your paper in. But if you don't have the die, you could just take a craft knife and ruler and then just line it up along there and cut that yourself. So there we are. So here is a look at the finished card, and just kind of want to give a little tilt here and there so you can kind of see some of that shimmer in the background. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the new Distress Spritz and seeing how I used it to create this card. Until next time, stay crafty and curious, my friend. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.